Hello, I'm Alistair Newton, and I'm speaking today with author Hugh Brewster, author of the new book RMS Titanic, Gilded Lives on a Fatal Voyage. Now, there's been a million permutations of the history of the Titanic, but there actually is this very fascinating queer historical moment going on there too. And that's sort of the center of your book. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I have a chapter called Queer A Lot of People, and my two protagonists, Frank Millet and Archie Butt, I believe were both gay. We have strong evidence that Frank was gay from some very homoerotic love letters he wrote as a young man, and Archie too from his letters. And I then speculate about some of the other gay lives on board, some of which we have evidence for, others of which are based on speculation. But clearly there were just as many queer people a century ago as there are today.
So talk to me a little bit about Frank Millet. He sort of becomes a little bit of a protagonist.
He is.
You found this very fascinating letter at the Smithsonian. Can you talk about that?
I did. I mean, Frank Millet to me seems to be, to exemplify the Gilded Age. In fact, I jokingly say that he was the Forrest Gump of the Gilded Age, because wherever things were going on, Frank Millet was there. He was a drummer boy in the Civil War, which is after which the Gilded Age began. He was an artist in Paris, in Montmartre, with St. Gaudens and all the expat artist set. He was the man who made the White City white for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And yet he also stepped outside of boundaries. In the archives I discovered these very unabashedly homoerotic love letters that he'd sent as a young artist to a San Francisco poet. And his last letter from the Titanic to his very good friend, Alfred Parsons, an artist and garden designer, and a lifelong confirmed bachelor, talks about the queer lot of people on board. Now, he probably doesn't mean queer in the modern sense. However, he then says, there seems to be a lot of our people on board, in inverted commas. So I speculate as to, all right, well, if he did mean our people, and it is early for any sort of gay identity, I realize, but if he did mean our people, who would they be? And then I talk about some of the other people on board who, in all probability, were gay people.
So talk to me about Archie Butt then. Who was Archie?
Oh, Archie is one of the most fascinating characters. He was a 47-year-old dandified bachelor, changed his clothes and uniform 7 times a day at the White House. He was devoted to the memory of his mother, whom and he lived in a Washington townhouse that he shared with other bachelors and some Filipino houseboys, surrounded by mementos of his mother. And he wrote letters almost daily, first to his mother, and then after she died to his sister-in-law, describing in intimate detail the life of the White House and the life of social Washington. And to me, these letters reveal a ragtime-era gay man hiding in plain sight. I mean, Archie could remember from memory a full selection of First Lady Edith Roosevelt's evening gowns, including such details as black velvet with passementerie down the front. Show me a straight man who can do that. He also talks about the, quote, pulchritude of the male element, and that somebody was as handsome as a Greek athlete. And one letter is devoted entirely to the beauty of a young sailor from the presidential yacht as seen in his bathing costume. So I have never met a straight man who has all those attributes in one person.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of our people, there were some Canadians that were among our people. These were the Three Musketeers. Can you speak about them?
We seem to be overrepresented, I have to say. The Three Musketeers were 3 middle-aged bachelors, very close friends. There was reputedly a 4th musketeer, possibly a partner of Hugo Ross's. Again, it's reading between the lines, but it took considerable courage in 1912 to remain a bachelor, when marriage bestowed respectability and manhood. And so most gay men, like Frank Millet, married. But the Three Musketeers never did, and they used to travel together every winter. And this year they had taken a trip down the Nile where Hugo Ross had come down with dysentery. And so he was sick in his cabin for most of the voyage. But the other 2 were regularly seen in the smoking room. But all 3 of them died, and only Thompson Beattie's body was recovered.
And there is a fascinating track in the book relating to Oscar Wilde and W.T.
Absolutely.
Stead.
Yes.
Who was W.T. Stead?
Well, W.T. Stead, who was on the Titanic, was the most famous journalist of his day. He was more famous than Bob Woodward or anybody you could name today. He was the pioneer of investigative journalism. And on the Titanic, as Frank Millet is writing his last letter about the queer lot of people on board, W.T. Stead was also writing what would be his last letter, because he would die on the Titanic as well. And these letters were to be dropped at Queenstown in Ireland when the Titanic anchored offshore there on its second day. And in one of his last letters, W.T. Stead calls the Titanic a monstrous floating Babylon. Now, Babylon at the time was a biblical reference everyone understood, which meant decadent and sinful and so on. And it also invokes Stead's most famous journalistic crusade, which was known as the Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, an investigation of underage prostitution in London in support of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. And because of Stead's sensational articles, which absolutely caused a sensation, they caused riots in the streets as people tried to get copies of them. People had never seen such frankly sexual content in print before. At any rate, that spurred a law in Parliament informally known as Stead's Law. And at the last moment, during the debate in Parliament, someone inserted a clause that also made relations between men illegal, thus criminalizing homosexuality in Britain until 1957. So Stead probably never intended this, but he was indirectly the man who put Oscar Wilde in prison, because 10 years after Stead's Law was passed, Oscar Wilde was convicted under this law and sent to prison for the 2 years of hard labor that the law required. And it, of course, led to his early death.
Well, thank you so much, Hugh Brewster, for speaking to me. And the book is RMS Titanic, Gilded Lives on a Fatal Voyage. Available now.